It is 11 o'clock. This is Sky News' extended press preview, our top story. Donald Trump says he could soon meet Vladimir Putin for talks on a ceasefire in Ukraine. It comes after Trump's top negotiator met the Russian president for what has been described as constructive talks, also tonight. Israel's Prime Minister prepares to push his cabinet for an all-out occupation of Gaza as more stories of death and desperation emerge from there. Taxing times for the Chancellor as an influential think tank warns she needs to tackle an economic black hole of more than £40 billion. Well, over the next hour, we will be discussing today's news with our reviewers, Adam Bolton and Lucy Beresford. And later we'll have a full run-through for you of tomorrow's front pages. Good evening. During his presidential campaign, Donald Trump repeatedly claimed he could end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. He changed that tone when he returned to the White House, but his push for peace is gathering pace again, with talk tonight of a face-to-face meeting with Vladimir Putin, possibly as soon as next week. Earlier, the US Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, held 3 hours of talks with Mr. Putin in Moscow, which Donald Trump described as highly productive. The US president is said to have raised the prospect of a meeting with his Russian counterpart during a phone call with Ukraine's president tonight. Other European leaders were on the call too, including, we understand, Sir Keir Starmer. So speaking at the White House then, in the last few minutes, he said there's a good chance they will meet soon.
We had some very good talks with President Putin today. And there's a very good chance that we could be ending the round, ending the end of that road. That road was long and continues to be long, but there's a good chance that there will be a meeting very soon.
Well, over the next hour, we will bring you tonight's headlines, tomorrow's front pages, and the views of our paper reviewers, the political commentator, Adam Bolton, and the broadcaster and psychotherapist, Lucy Beresford. Welcome to both of you. In the meantime, let us go straight to the White House and speak to our US correspondent, David Blevins, who's been listening in. I mean, this massive day of contradictions, David, and yet the prospect is held up of a three-way meeting on Ukraine, possibly. And we just heard Donald Trump. So amid this breathlessness, what have we learned?
Well, in a matter of hours, we've gone from President Trump accusing Russia of posing a threat to America's national security and imposing harsh sanctions on India for buying Russian oil to a place where President Trump is suggesting that there is a very real prospect of him meeting with President Putin, his Russian counterpart. This comes after a report in the New York Times that the two could come face-to-face as early as next week. In response to that report, the President's press secretary, Caroline Levitt, said the Russians had expressed a desire to meet Donald Trump and he was open to that idea. And a White House official told our colleagues at NBC that a meeting could indeed take place next week if Putin also agrees to meet with President Zelensky. Now, what a prospect that would be. Presidents Trump, Putin and Zelensky all in the one room. That is a huge if. But we understand they are exploring options in terms of a venue, and while their aim is for a meeting next week, they are conceding that the timeline could slip. Now, all of this comes after those talks between the President's Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Vladimir Putin today. He described those talks as highly successful. But at the end of the day, Witkoff didn't emerge from the Kremlin with a ceasefire, and that is America's demand. That's why sanctions remain in play. It'll be interesting to see if those sanctions are indeed imposed by Friday's deadline.
Indeed so. And, to add to the confusion, secondary sanctions imposed on India, an importer of Russian oil, 25% taking their total prospectively to 50%. So that's been part of the confusing messages today.
Yes, you talked about the contradictions, Anna. On one hand, we've the President imposing these sanctions on India this evening, warning that there will be secondary sanctions on other nations. And at the same time, he's talking about the prospect of him meeting with Vladimir Putin for face-to-face talks. It would appear that Donald Trump is doing two things at the same time, attempting to establish or maintain some kind of peace process that might ultimately lead to the end of the war in Ukraine, but also attempting to be seen to assert dominance over Russia, to hold sway there. It's a balancing act in many ways. But as you said at the beginning, he vowed that he would bring the war in Ukraine to an end within 24 hours. And here we are on day 198 of his presidency, and we may, just may, be one step closer towards that.
David Blevins, thank you very much indeed. And of course, your podcast continues, all of you there in the States, well beyond Trump's first 100 days. Anyway, there's the newspapers on this. The Financial Times reporting the Russian President Vladimir Putin welcomed the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in Moscow for talks ahead of Trump's deadline for a ceasefire in Ukraine. The US President says those talks made great progress. That makes the front page of The Guardian. And inside The Times, there's a warning Trump's tariffs on India, imposed because of their demand for Russian oil, risk pushing the country towards China. So let's get the thoughts of Adam Bolton and Lucy Beresford. Thanks for waiting through the Trump news conference as well for all of that. Anyway, where are we at? We've got the photograph on the front of the FT, if we see the full front page, of Putin meeting Witkoff, the prospect of a meeting with Trump, and then more secondary sanctions threatened. Very interesting day.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that in spite of that nearly an hour-long press conference, actually the newspapers which published these front pages before that press conference pretty much got the story there. As you say, we've got the Witkoff meeting, which, it has to be said, the first thing said by the Russians were much less committal than what we've heard from the Americans. They simply said signals had been exchanged, it had been a good meeting. Nothing about further meetings, but we've then got, the Telegraph had the story already, Trump to hold talks with Putin and Zelensky. This is the possibility of three-way talks, which is something that certainly President Zelensky has wanted for a long time. And the fact that Trump, after that meeting where Witkoff, as David Blevins was saying, didn't get the ceasefire, immediately consulted with his allies, consulted with Zelensky, and then said, we're going to have this meeting. That, I think, is, extremely interesting. And it is what the papers are reporting. And we've got the same at the top of the Times as well, that Trump is seeking three-way peace talks with Putin and Zelensky. He didn't actually spell that out in that news conference, but it appears that's what they're working towards. And, of course, all of this is in the context of Friday is supposed to be the deadline for Russia to agree a ceasefire. So I suspect there may be quite a lot of action over the next few days, although Trump has let deadlines slip in the past.
Well, indeed, he wafted a B-2 bomber model, did he not, during this moment in the Oval Office to show what happens if you don't meet deadlines. This is the context of the bombing of Iran as well.
Yeah, but interesting that because he was asked about what's going on in Gaza at the moment, and he completely blanked that. He didn't answer that question at all, simply referred to the B-2 bombers and the job that they'd done, obliterating, as he put it.
But he has quite a short attention span. And as far as he's concerned, he's really focusing on the Ukraine story. And he himself was linking those extra tariffs on India as being part of what has potentially brought Putin to the table. And then later in the conference, he, again, there's always so much ambiguity with him. So, and I would argue it's very strategic ambiguity, that actually it is about keeping people guessing and people not really knowing when you're going to clunk your fist as the bully and who you're going to clunk it on. But he said, well, I've done it to India, and there may be some other countries, and one of those countries might be China. And at that point, Putin starts to think, where am I going to get my money from?
And yet the reliance on Russian oil is so seismic that you can't imagine the pipelines being cut, can you, effectively?
I mean, the Indians have already said they're not going to take any notice, and they've said what's been done is unjust, unjustifiable, and unreasonable. So, there are those, as you read out earlier on, saying that all this is going to do is to push India closer to China, although it has to be said they are pretty much historic rivals and enemies.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And, they think it's highly double standards from America. India pointing out that certain imports, uranium, hexafluoride, palladium and fertilizer are still being brought in by the US from Russia. So they have double standards. Absolutely furious about this, why they've been picked upon, why not China or even NATO ally Turkey, which also imports from Russia.
Well, again, it's very rarely about the logic of it. It's about the optics of it. And Donald Trump has this unerring ability to work out what the theatre of all of this is. And he's realised, even though he did say, I will solve this problem on day one, even he can see that there is so much box office afforded to him to be able to, now it's strung out. Everybody is going to be watching that moment, if the meeting does go ahead, of Donald Trump meeting Vladimir Putin. Who on earth thought that would ever happen?
And Zelensky. If he gets them together and there's a ceasefire, he will certainly think he's earned the Nobel Peace Prize, which he's so obsessed with.
And that's why it doesn't even matter about the tariffs, because it may very well be that the war is ended. Let's say the war theoretically ends in a week's time. The fact that India's had tariffs put on it, those tariffs will be eliminated at that point. So, in a way, nobody needs to react to it. It's all about the showmanship.
It is interesting, though, that he's chosen to put the pressure on India because, of course, that is probably the most significant trade negotiation trade deal that the UK has struck with India, the fifth largest trading partner. Now, just hypothetically, supposing Trump were to say, listen, you guys have all been saying I've got to support Ukraine, why don't you put big tariffs on India to increase the pressure? I think that would be very awkward for Sir Keir Starmer.
Well, Donald Trump hailed him as my great mate Modi. Do you know what I mean? That's gone. It's very interesting. Anyway, there's the US tariffs risk pushing India towards Beijing. That's the line you were talking about there. The great smiles between this man. What is it? Is it the fourth visit of Witkoff to Moscow to try and get this, and St. Petersburg, I think he went to as well, didn't he? Ukraine thwarts Russian drones with fishing nets banned after Brexit. This is the war continuing, isn't it? You probably can't see that picture, but all along a road, there's fishing nets in the sky, between trees, so that drones can't get through to allow them to use the roads. This is the changing face of modern warfare, which we've seen in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think we should just blow a raspberry in Witkoff's direction. This New York property man, friend of Donald Trump, has achieved absolutely nothing in the two areas that he's been committed, Russia and also in the Middle East.
But I think I would sort of agree with you, because he doesn't actually have anything to show for it, apart from the fact that these
Gaza ceasefire, to be fair.
Apart from the fact that
that did happen.
These people are still talking. They are still potentially coming to the table. And I think all he's needed to do was to keep them engaged. He didn't necessarily need to come up with a solution, but he needed to keep them engaged, and that's happened. And then that's when Donald Trump comes in and does his big "it's all about me" routine.
Yeah, so there could be a meeting, and there could be further secondary tariffs, or sanctions rather, on other nations as well as India, but we'll have to wait and see, as usual with Donald Trump. But the deadline still remains of Friday, the 8th of August. There's another event happening as well this week, which is Israel's Security Cabinet meeting. So we go from the conflict in Ukraine to another war, this one in Gaza, where officials say at least 20 people were killed when an aid truck overturned after being overwhelmed by crowds seeking food. The Palestinian Red Crescent says its headquarters in the Gaza Strip have once again been struck by the Israeli military. And tomorrow then, Benjamin Netanyahu is set to convene a meeting of his security cabinet to discuss an all-out occupation of Gaza. Here's our international correspondent, Diana Magni, reporting from Jerusalem.
If it's not bombs, it is the constant blaring of horns, the endless sound of emergency as the injured are brought in to the doors of the Nasser hospital in southern Gaza. Young boys and men who just a few hours earlier were pushing and jostling to get food from aid trucks in the Morag corridor. And now they're treated for gunshot wounds mostly, where there's space on the floor with pools of blood around them. Bullets plucked from flesh. Who was shooting, we don't know, but there are a lot of injuries. This next bit of footage from the Nasser hospital we've decided that we cannot air because it is too graphic. But basically it shows a young man, or boy really. He's dead, he's lying on a stretcher, and he has a bullet wound directly to the centre of his chest. Whoever did this, it was a targeted shot. Israel rejects accusations that the daily killings of people looking for aid has anything to do with them. They say they fire only warning shots and are not aware of casualties.
I've heard many of those complaints, and in many cases, what's missing is the statement that it's from IDF. You know, what happens is the hospital get people who are mistreated. Some of them are in crowded areas. Some are getting shot by Hamas. And whoever, for some reason, the whole world and the international community, whoever is injured in Gaza is automatically counted as someone who was injured by the IDF.
An aid distribution like this is chaotic, there's no doubt about that. Thousands swarming to get their hands on whatever they can. There will be accidents. Like this, an aid truck overturned late last night, crushing and killing 20 people beneath it. We've blurred the footage because it is extremely disturbing. The Palestinian Red Crescent posted on Wednesday that their headquarters in Khan Yunis was targeted again, they say by Israeli forces. The second artillery strike in 3 days. Sunday's hit killing one staff member and wounding 3 more. Sky News is seeking a response from the IDF. In Gaza City, these are the latest funerals for people killed as they looked for aid. So much grief in these final goodbyes.
He went to help his parents get flour. He was shot in the head and he was martyred. May he rest in peace.
And this is all before a possible expansion of Israeli military operations in Gaza. How many more then to add to the 61,000 dead? Diana Magnay, Sky News, Jerusalem.
Well, let's take a look at coverage then in the newspapers. The Financial Times reporting Benjamin Netanyahu's allies are pressing the army to launch a new offensive in Gaza. That's one of the small stories on the right-hand column there. Telegraph, right down the bottom, the Telegraph says an Israeli Air Force boss has refused to bomb Gaza and fell into a shouting match over the civilian death toll. And meanwhile, The Guardian reports that leading academics call on the UK to reverse the ban on the campaign group Palestine Action amid the prospects of what will happen on Saturday at a march. So let's bring in Adam and Lucy on this. So tomorrow, the big event is a Security Cabinet meeting in Israel to work out what to do next about Gaza. Israelis are split, this story is saying. You know, this is a significant moment, is it not?
Yes, well, the cabinet is split, but also we've seen quite a lot of coverage of demonstrations in places like Jerusalem and Tel Aviv with Israelis who are just so terrified that the hostages are still not being returned. And they're feeling that Netanyahu is directly responsible for the lack of movement on that particular issue. So to now discover that actually there's tensions within the cabinet as well is really quite intriguing, that sense of, will he fight on? Will there be some kind of cabinet insurrection, or could actually be the way in which his power is checked?
I mean, there was also this letter from, I think, all the heads of Israeli intelligence and previous heads of the IDF against this plan of simply going in,
which was written directly to Donald Trump, not to Netanyahu.
Yeah. So we know that Israeli society is absolutely divided, but you know, Netanyahu probably does have the cabinet behind him, and his logic is probably to try and obliterate Gaza. The point being, of course, that...
Or obliterate Hamas. Do you mean Gaza? Or do
no, I mean Gaza. You know, to take total control of Gaza, to occupy Gaza, whatever happens next is, you know, the big question. But if he does that, it's going to mean him going into areas where it's believed the hostages are. So effectively, the feeling is that he would be writing off the hostages in pursuit of a military victory.
And I don't think the nation would ever forgive him for that. I think that it's almost one of their biggest tenets is we always want to bring our boys home. Metaphorically, obviously, it's not just boys, but it's about saying we will fight to the end to get anyone who is kidnapped or taken hostage to bring them back. And that I think, would be a huge psychological transgression on his part.
And it was about a year ago, was it not, that 6 hostages were killed as IDF forces arrived nearby. The Telegraph talks about splits also. You've talked about splits in society, splits in cabinet, splits in the military.
Yeah.
It says Israeli military chiefs fell into a shouting match over the civilian death toll from airstrikes in Gaza, according to reports. Major General Yanef Assor, head of the Army's Southern Command, is said to have complained to Major General Tomer Bar that the Air Force was routinely overruling bombing requests by his officers. In response, Major General Bar, the Israeli Air Force chief, said many of the strikes were unnecessarily killing civilians and showed a lack of professionalism. This is quoting sources. So, you know, does the IDF want to go fully into Gaza? Does it have the manpower to fully occupy when much of its forces are reservists who presumably have to go back to their private work and are exhausted and debilitated after so long at war in Gaza?
I think the chances of mutiny, though, are very low because Israeli society, ultimately, if they're ordered to do something, they may try and soften it, as we're hearing there, but that, you know, it's unlikely, I think, the IDF will simply refuse to obey those orders if they come from the cabinet.
But it's interesting that that's happening within the military, because that's also been happening internationally, where you've had really staunch defenders of Israel looking at what's been happening in Gaza and saying, actually, maybe you are going too far. Maybe, actually, this is something that you need to pull back from. And to know that that's actually a debate that's happening, as you say, a shouting match that's happening within the military, speaks to what's happening in more international conversations.
Well, The Guardian with another, dramatic front page. Palestinians flee after an attack by the Israeli military on the Al Zaytun neighbourhood of Gaza City today. But they're talking about the prescribed group Palestine Action. There's supposed to be a march in support, or encouraging people to be in support of Palestine Action. And they're suggesting that dozens of international scholars and writers have signed a letter to The Guardian calling on the government to reverse its ban on Palestine Action, while Sir Keir Starmer himself has been speaking about why he supports it, Adam.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I have to say, in terms of people's opinions on the Middle East, these are the usual suspects. I mean, don't forget there's been, for many years now, there's been an academic boycott by some academics of Israel. And I don't think the fact that Naomi Klein has put her name to this, I mean, it may appeal to Guardian readers, but I don't think it's going to change the mind of the government, which has just prescribed Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation. The Prime Minister today, as you say, speaking to the Labour National Executive, did say that he was right, the UK government was right to define Palestine Action as a terrorist group. And he went on to say it wasn't just a question of support for the activities of Hamas and against Israel, but also he said that they were targeting Jewish-owned businesses in this country. Now, he said that they did £7 million worth of damage when they broke into the airbase and sprayed paint around. I don't know whether he's saying that they were planning on vandalising or destroying businesses, because, again, in the section of people who are pro-Palestinian, there's been organised boycotts of Israeli activity and Israeli business for a very long time.
OK, it's interesting. We'll see what happens on Saturday as well, won't we? And what happens at that cabinet meeting tomorrow in Israel. Do stay there, both of you, and you at home as well. Coming up, we will have this on the front of the Daily Telegraph: the Prime Minister's refusal to rule out tax increases in order to plug a suggested £50 billion black hole in the economy. Back in a moment.